Today had been a particularly hard day at work, and by the time I got home, fatigue was weighing on me with every step. I trudged heavily down the stairs, wishing for nothing more than to go to bed. When I opened the front door, I was immediately greeted by a familiar voice coming from the living room. My mother-in-law, Margaret, was engaged in a lively conversation. I entered the room with a nod of greeting and quickly realized the purpose of her displeasure. My wife, Sarah, was sprawled out on the bed, clearly drunk and only occasionally shrieking in response to her mother's scolding. I mentally sighed. Once Margaret left, I had to take care of Sarah for the rest of the evening. When Sarah had her breakdowns, it inevitably led to her anger turning on me. The alcohol was further damaging her mood, and I knew the evening ahead would be tense. Wanting to create a little distance, I left both women in the room and headed to the kitchen to prepare dinner. I called out to Margaret, inviting her to join me. "Margaret, let's have dinner together." She responded with a modest nod and joined me just as I was setting the table. Margaret sat down at the table and explained that Sarah had fallen asleep after being exhausted from drinking. We ate in silence at first, with the clinking of cutlery being the only sound in the kitchen. To show my appreciation for her support, I offered her some brandy. Margaret gladly accepted. After the first glass, she asked for some more, and I realized she was enjoying it. Soon, we started talking about her work, her weekend plans, her worries about Sarah. The earlier tension disappeared, and we fell into casual conversation, a rare moment of calmness shared between us. For a moment, it seemed to me that we were just two people enjoying a quiet evening together. As we talked, I began to notice details about Margaret that I hadn't paid much attention to before. The way her eyes softened when she spoke of her concerns, the slight smile that appeared whenever she felt at ease. It was strange to feel so connected to her in that moment, almost as if we were equals, sharing the burden of this night. I poured her another glass of brandy, and she nodded in agreement, lingering her gaze on me a moment longer than usual. I didn't know how to feel about it, but it felt good to feel the warmth of her presence. When Margaret offered to do the dishes, I took the opportunity to check on Sarah. She was still lying on the bed, only half covered by a crumpled shirt. I carefully adjusted the blanket to cover her better, her face flushed from the alcohol. After checking on her, I headed for the shower, hoping the warm water would wash away the day's fatigue. It did help. The water pounded my tired muscles, releasing the tension lodged deep in my bones. But as soon as I stepped out of the bathroom, I found myself face to face with Margaret in the narrow hallway. We crossed paths in the small space, finding ourselves too close to each other. Margaret was an attractive woman, and I had always recognized that. Tall and slender, she looked much younger than her 47 years. Usually, her beauty was hidden behind strict conservative outfits, but one day, when we went out of town, I saw her in jeans and a t-shirt, looking relaxed, almost carefree. Despite my love for Sarah, there were moments when my thoughts drifted to Margaret. It was always just a fantasy I didn't consider a reality, especially with a woman as principled as she was. But now, standing in the narrow hallway, I realized that Margaret was wearing one of Sarah's robes. The sight of her like that confused me, made my pulse race. I froze for a second. Perhaps I was still affected by the brandy, and then stepped back quickly to put some distance between us. Margaret looked just as uncertain, a hint of embarrassment in her eyes. Her cheeks were slightly flushed, and I wondered if she felt the same strange tension I did. I retreated to the living room, needing a moment to clear my thoughts. A few minutes later, Margaret entered the room. She quietly closed the door behind her, and the air was filled with an electric tension. Our eyes met, and in that moment I realized that the boundary between us had shifted. Words had become superfluous. The silence said it all. Margaret took an uncertain step forward, her gaze seeking my answer. My pulse quickened, and the distance between us seemed to disappear. Doubts and questions swarmed in my head, but my body seemed to move on its own. Margaret stood still, her expression indecisive, and something vulnerable. It was as if she were waiting for me to make a choice, to bridge the gap between us. My heart raced in my chest, and before I knew it, my hand was reaching for her arm. The touch was brief, but it pierced me. Margaret didn't pull away. Instead, she stepped closer. Her breath mingled with mine, and for a moment, the rest of the world seemed to disappear. The next morning, I awoke to the smell of breakfast cooking. Margaret was in the kitchen making scrambled eggs, and Sarah was asleep, probably suffering from a well-deserved hangover. I slipped out of bed and joined Margaret in the kitchen. Our eyes met, and she smiled at me, a smile of unspoken understanding. I smiled back, realizing that this probably wouldn't be the last time she made breakfast for me. There was something different in the air, a strange mixture of ordinariness and something deeper, as if we now had a shared secret that bound us together. Margaret moved easily through the kitchen, her movements smooth and graceful. I watched her as she worked, her hands skillfully preparing the food. When we sat down to eat, Margaret asked if I wanted coffee. Her tone was casual, though her eyes lingered on me longer than necessary. I nodded, and as she handed me the cup, her fingers touched mine, sending shivers down my spine. I wondered what would happen next. Would we pretend nothing had happened? Was it just a one-time mistake, or was something more waiting for us? Questions swirled around in my head, but I pushed them aside, focusing on the warm coffee and Margaret's gentle smile. After breakfast, Margaret said she had things to do. I offered to help, but she politely declined, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Take care of Sarah," she said softly, her eyes lingering on mine for a moment longer than usual. I nodded, watching as she gathered her things and left the house, slamming the door behind her. The sound of the door closing seemed to echo, leaving me with a feeling of emptiness. There was silence in the house. I leaned back in my chair, replaying the events of the night before the conflicting emotions of guilt, confusion, and undeniable excitement. Whatever had happened between Margaret and me had changed something in me. I didn't know where this path would lead, but deep down, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. I sat for a long time, staring at the empty kitchen. The sunlight streamed through the window, casting patterns on the floor, but I hardly noticed it. All my thoughts were occupied with memories of Margaret's touch, her eyes, the way she'd looked at me. I felt a mixture of fear and excitement, the kind of feeling one gets when stepping into the unknown. I knew I should feel guilty. Sarah was my wife, and I loved her, but there was something about Margaret that drew me in, that I couldn't ignore. After what seemed like an eternity, I finally got up and started cleaning the kitchen. This chore helped me clear my mind, but only slightly. The memories of the night before wouldn't leave me, and I knew it would be a long time before I could get rid of them. As I washed the dishes, I wondered what Margaret was thinking, if she felt the same way I did. Would she come back tonight? Would we continue to dance around this unspoken tension, or would we cross that line again? I had no answers, and it scared me. But as I gazed out the window, watching the leaves sway gently in the wind, I realized that part of me was looking forward to it. The uncertainty, the thrill of the unknown, it was intoxicating. And for better or worse, I knew I was already too far gone to turn back.